Good afternoon. My name is Ana Lucia Escudero. I'm the head of communications at IDB Invest, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live to launch the report, Equality Needs Everyone, the role of men in gender equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how different companies in Latin America and the Caribbean are engaging men in this endeavor. During this LinkedIn Live, we'll be hearing from specialists who have been trailblazers in this field. Among them, Stephanie Ueda, Head of Gender, Diversity, and Inclusion at IDB Invest. Welcome, Stephanie. Gary Baker, President and CEO of Promundo. Welcome, Gary. And
hey.
Angela, nice to meet you. Nice to have you here, Gary. And Angela Burge, Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consulting Leader at Mercer. Welcome, Angela. Well, I wanted to start off and tell you more about the report and how it lays out two objectives. First, to capture the perceptions of people who will work in private sector companies about the role of men as allies in gender equality. And secondly, how to identify the practices and policies that companies are implemented or can implement in the future. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping items. The LinkedIn Live will be in English, but please send us your questions both in English and Spanish. We're happy to hear them. We will record this session for those who couldn't join and share after. Secondly, thanks to all of our clients and member companies from the Gender Parity Accelerators who have contributed to the report through their insights and opinions. Third, at the end of the conversation, we will have a space for questions and answers, and we really hope that you can start sending us those questions now through LinkedIn Live. And finally, you can download the report. We'll place it the chat box so you can see and download it now. Well, let's get started. Stephanie, tell us, can you share with us two main findings that surprised you from this report?
Absolutely. First of all, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. Let me just start by saying why a report on men and gender and diversity. Well, we've been working a long time in this field, and the only way that we're going to advance in having a more inclusive workplace, a more inclusive society, is if everyone participates. But what do we see is that men still hold position of power, position of privilege, and we needed to understand why is that sometimes they're allies and sometimes maybe we still need to work around that. And I want to make a very specific element here. Throughout the report and throughout the LinkedIn Live, you will hear us say the word men. But I want to emphasize that we recognize the variety of experience and identities contained within men, and we celebrate that diversity. But for the purpose of this report, we're going to refer to men as cisgender, heterosexual, fully able men, because they have historically held certain advantages that put them in privileged positions. So being clear on what is the wording that we're going to have, let me continue on why gender, and specifically to your question, Ana Lucia, what surprised us. When we started thinking why a report on men, we couldn't think of two better partners to accompany with us than Mercer and Promundo. So we really started working and focusing really on what is the reality in Latin America and the Caribbean. You have to know that in the latest report, 72% of respondents have said that yes, they believe that women still face challenges in order to advance in the workplace. So our region that has particularly set of social norms, machismo, it's still suffering from this. So we did a deep dive, and we did a deep dive in which over 260 companies from the region, from 16 countries, from every sector of the economy, banks, infrastructure companies, corporates, really responded to several questions. We had a balanced panel, 49% of women, 50% of men, and 1% of undefined. So we really had a good basis to start working and having some insights. So what did surprise us from there? Well, not surprisingly, I would say 8 out of 10 people in the private sector in Latin America and the Caribbean confirmed that men play a key role in achieving gender equality. So again, no surprise. We know that we cannot do this only by ourselves. We need everyone to work around it. But what was more interesting is that when we look at that number, almost 50% did not understand or did not see how gender equality would benefit men. So this is very important because if you don't see a benefit, why would you work on something? So clearly we have seen that the business case that has existed for now several years, that has been out there on why diversity benefits every one of us from innovation perspective, from talent retention, even from shareholders and return on investment, clearly has not permeated. So we really need to continue to emphasize this and really understand why is that men still do not see that gender equality could benefit them. So we clearly have a message here is that we need to focus on why benefits of gender equality could be good for men. And I know that Gary has something to tell us about that.
Thank you, Stephanie. That is really insightful. It's so important to have men actively participate, but it's also equally important to note how it benefits them too. So Gary, please tell us, you're not only the CEO, but founder of Promundo, one of the first organizations in the world to address the role that men have in gender equality. And Promundo has this long trajectory working with men towards equality. Can you tell us, according to the report and the findings, how can men become better allies? What benefits does allyship bring men?
Thanks, Ana Lucia, and thanks, Stephanie. It's been a pleasure for Promundo to be part of this together with IDB and Mercer. And I think I think what we find in the report echoes a lot of what we're hearing in the US, and I would say in other countries as well, about where we are in this journey on gender equality. And I think when we started Promundo 20 years back, we spent a lot of time, doing the convincing of why men were even part of gender equality, why men were in the room for these conversations, why men even needed to, pay attention to it. And I think now this study and where we are in lots of places in the world is to say the how. Whether it's decades of women's rights activism by key civil society organizations, by voices within organizations as at IDB, I think there's an awareness that there's no negotiation, that gender equality is a reality that we are all pushing for and that needs to happen. We're no longer negotiating about if it needs to happen, we're talking about the how. And I think there's also a greater understanding that men are part of it. Sometimes that's as harm, and that's what we've been calling out in the last years. When I say we, the key women's advocates who have been doing this work around Me Too and all of its variations have been about calling men out for harm. But I think the question and what this report begins to highlight is, what do we do to call men in? What is the inclusion that says we need men to be part of this? So the good news is that men say yes, employers say yes, I need to be part of it. The issue is the how and the what men see as their roles. And I think part of that starts with helping men see that we're in this game too. In English, we will use an expression at times that men need to see that we have skin in this game. And as Stephanie noted, we're mostly talking about cisgender men who have been those. We are the ones who carry that privilege in these systems of inequality. And certainly part of what we need to do is to talk about that privilege. But a lot of what we need to do is to say, how do we live within this? What we saw in the study in terms of what men see as their benefits, they talk about less social and economic pressure if we're not the only providers and breadwinners. We see that, and in fact, that's what's happening to a greater extent across Latin America. Women are working in paid work more. We still haven't achieved equality, but that is good for us men who are in heterosexual relationships, for example. Men say the work environments are better. When we make work environments safer, inclusive, diverse, men tell us that we like those workplaces as well. Listening to different opinions, incorporating different visions, the possibility of being the full hands-on caregivers that we want to be. And I think that's a point to look at as well. COVID has been a huge wake-up call on this, whether we look at women's job loss, how much many of us have been at home or working part of the time at home, how many times we've seen our children, our dogs, and others in the household passing behind us on screen. The division between what's paid work and what's work at home, it really doesn't exist much anymore. And I think we're all aware of how much all of us need to think of ourselves as caregivers as well as providers. And I think modern workplaces are getting, if you don't think about the linkages between these worlds, you're behind. we did a study together with our partners at the Global Corporate Parental Leave Task Force that we created together with Dove Men Plus Care during COVID of international corporations based in the US and the UK. The vast majority enacted new parental leave policies during COVID, and the vast majority said they would keep those after COVID, and the vast majority said those policies helped them weather COVID. So I think all of us are finding this win-win-win. And I'm also excited that I hear more and more men talking about success means different things to them these days. It is not only about, can I get promoted? Can I make more money? But I do hear more and more men talking about the obvious, that the quality of our relationships. And our research finds that men who buy into a more progressive view of manhood, see themselves as equal, see the masculinity in healthier ways, that we take care of ourselves, we take care of others. Men can see these benefits in our lives. So I'm excited about that. And yet we've got a lot to do to bring corporations on board to see that, and to see men holding themselves accountable to the equality that we all need, and also embracing the benefits that come with it. And look forward to hearing from our colleagues at Mercer as well about their take on this. Thanks.
Wow, Gary, thank you so much. So many things. I love what you just said. Number one, we're in this game too. Men are in this game too. We have skin in the game. And number two, what success means now. It's different, for some men, and how some of the companies that you're working with are keeping some of these new policies and practices in their work environment. So all of those things are positive things. Well, now we have the privilege, as you were mentioning, with Angela and Mercer. Angela, thank you for being on the call now. We know that you couldn't join in on the Zoom to see your face, your lovely face, but thank you for joining by phone. Angela is the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consulting Leader for Mercer, one of the leading consulting firms for talent insights. So thanks for being here. And I'd love to hear from you. What's working? How can companies begin engaging men in the conversation on gender equality? And are there any data points that surprised you from the study?
Well, thank you, Ana Lucia. I want to say it was such an honor to be part of this incredible research effort, and I'm thrilled to be here today as we officially launch it. And my apologies that we had some tech issues with me to also be present on the video. One of the comments I want to say to start is that this launch is incredibly timely. Over the past year, and Gary touched on this, as the result of the pandemic, we've seen a huge surge of employer focus on gender equality efforts in this region. Companies know that they need to re-engage women in the workforce. They're doing something about it. And we also see that there continues to be growing pressure for publicly traded companies in the region to show meaningful progress on gender equality. As Stephanie and Gary both said, men continue to have the privilege of dominating leadership and pivotal frontline manager roles in this region, most regions. And so it's only natural that engaging men in the gender equality conversation should be a top priority for companies. So along those lines, you asked, what can companies do? What are they doing to engage men in driving gender equality? I'm going to share a few actions that we know are making a positive difference. The first step in helping men become allies is to continue to create and drive awareness that there are disparities in the workplace to begin with. One data point in the research that surprised me is that still a third of our focus group participants said that women don't face barriers in the workplace, or they didn't know if women face barriers. And that's a high number, and it suggests that employers still have work to do in educating men about the everyday challenges and that barriers that women face. The second action really builds on awareness, and it's to intentionally equip and train men to be allies. In working with organizations globally, we often hear that men do have appetite and they are ready to step up and be allies to women in the workplace, but they don't know how to do it. They don't know exactly what they can do to help. And the starting point of this is actually quite basic. The data from the study suggests that the starting point is really for men to be more empathetic listeners at work. Going back to our focus group, when we asked participants what behaviors and actions men could take to improve equality in the workplace. Being more empathetic, showing solidarity and respect was the top answer. It was actually rated 5 points higher than the next action that was identified, which was being an inclusive leader and good mentor. It was even rated higher than avoiding gender bias. So incredibly valuable for men to be more empathetic listeners. And we found that surprising that it rose to the list that high, and clearly shows the companies need to provide specific training to their male allies to be better listeners. Gary mentioned caregiving, and the study also pointed to caregiving as a very important area of focus. Mercer would say that as well from the work we do with clients. Companies are really in a unique position to get men more involved in family roles. We know it's a critical barrier to overcome in this region if progress is going to be made and sustained in gender equality. In the research, we found that nearly 100%, it was 97% of focus group participants, said that women take on most household and child care responsibilities. So not a surprise there, but it's clearly a barrier to full participation and advancement in the workplace. As one example, there are companies who've used their internal communication channels and campaigns to incentivize men to assume household and child care responsibilities is the same proportion as women. Companies have other tools available to them to get men engaged in the gender equality journey, parental leave policies that encourage men to take the same kind of time off that women would. And providing that pathway for men to take parental leave is a powerful signal that men should and can be equally engaged in child care responsibilities. And I want to call out that it's especially important and powerful if senior leaders take advantage of that kind of benefit to set the example for others. We always talk about gender equality as a journey. It is, and someone needs to lead the journey. And senior leaders should be really at the forefront. And companies who are putting leaders at the forefront of the journey, leaders who demonstrate how their personal allies to women are really making impressive progress. And I just want to quickly note, all that said, it's still critical to equip men to avoid bias when they make those important decisions around hiring, pay, promotions, even everyday project staffing. I want to call out in the report that there's a roadmap of very tangible actions that companies can take that can help progress that. These are just a few examples of how companies can engage men internally in the gender equality conversation. But let's look outside too. At Mercer, our long-held point of view has been that when women thrive, businesses and societies also thrive, and that companies have tremendous potential to improve gender equality both inside and outside of their own walls. Let's say, for example, the financial sector. Companies can consider how bias may be impacting credit decisions for their female clients. Corporate sector companies should consider if their traditional male dynamics in the purchasing function might be excluding women-owned businesses. You know, in both cases, companies are in a strong position to provide gender awareness and anti-bias training to incorporate those into their basic business practices to ensure that they're really promoting gender equality in everything they do. So to sum it up, companies, employers have many opportunities, and not just to engage men in the gender equality conversation, but to really lead the way. And we're excited that this study provides such clear and practical roadmap guidance and advice to really help companies step up for women and to engage men as allies along the critical way. And with that, Ana Lucia, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Angela. That was very rich information, and the work that you're doing at Mercer is so important. I loved hearing, all the percentages of the perceptions, how we think that we're still doing okay, but we're not yet, and how companies need to provide specific training is another message that I got from this, and caregiving, how we have to get men more involved in their roles, and how companies can provide that avenue. I love that you mentioned the roadmap. I think that was the best part of the report for me. I think we know the problem. How do we get to the solution, and how companies can start to see that and adopt that? So I want to encourage more questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, we're going to do a couple more with our panelists, but please send us your questions now in English or in Spanish. We're happy to answer them. You've got trailblazers here, so please take advantage. Stephanie, I wanted to touch upon the point that you were mentioning at the beginning about diversity as well, and how that, how companies are taking an active role in not just gender equality, but also diversity and inclusion. Can you speak more to the experiences that you've been having from IDB Invest?
Sure, and I think that a lot of what we mentioned, both Gary, Angela, and everything that you'll find in our report can really apply to other groups, right? In the past year and a half, we have seen that society and the business world has really taken a stand. Definitely, we can see that the movement of Black Lives Matter after the murder of George Floyd really spoke out and brought up a conversation that we were long due to have globally. But in Latin America, we must also not forget that we have over 15% of our population that is indigenous or traditional, right? We never hear about that. We never hear about how we could bring more people into employment, foster entrepreneurship. So that's something that we also need to look at. And we were mentioning as well at the beginning of our LinkedIn Live, right? The diversity of the gender spectrum. In Latin America, we are starting to really continue to span the conversation. And we have countries such as Argentina that have been trailblazer globally in advancing, for example, the rights of transgender people. So it's really important that we acknowledge this. And people with disability as well, right? In our region, we're counting more than 70 million. So we really have to start working around that. And I believe that in the past, that was definitely something that we saw mostly in North America and Western Europe, but now we're really seeing our region, our companies, multi-Latinas, really starting and leading the conversation in some cases. So I think that a lot of what you're going to find in the report, you could also apply to make your company more diverse and inclusive. And backing on to what Angela was mentioning, right? In the roadmap, you will see that it's not rocket science, right? The steps that anyone can take. Men, we're of course focusing on men because of everything that we mentioned about position of power, but anyone can be an ally. You can speak up for the person next to you. You could also speak about not having special treatment, but just being fair and people being able to have the opportunities. And if you are in a position of power, how are you using that power to create a more inclusive company? And more inclusive, not only, to be like a good corporate citizen, but it's because it's good for your business. You bring different people around the table, they will bring different ideas, but you need to create the space for them to speak up. Because otherwise, we have seen very much the revolving door. I think that we didn't talk so much during the LinkedIn Live about this, right? But what governments can do as well. We're focusing on the private sector, but these challenges are public-private elements that we should take into account. What is legislation doing to advance these topics? And that will also give an accelerator. We have seen that in Europe, for example, when governments and legislation has been passed to have more women at the top, at the beginning, there's a huge cry about like, oh, is she being appointed just because she's a woman? But what have we seen is that at the beginning, there's this backlash, but afterwards, we see that these items are necessary to create some advancement. And last but not least, I'd like to come back to something that Gary mentioned that is extremely important. Gender roles won't change in the workplace if they don't change at home. And COVID-19 crisis has shown us that we need to create an equilibrium into what's happening. And we also need to take a lot of these stereotypes that we have about men. We need also to liberate men and, giving them the space to be who they want to be in the full spectrum, not only a provider, not only a macho, not only someone that needs to be strong all the time or that needs to, project certain specificities that we have given as masculine. And I think that will have a huge impact in driving gender equality, but quite frankly, a more inclusive society. And we have seen it. And just to close and pass the word to my fellow panelists, to what Angela mentioned at the end, right? This is now also something that shareholders, the capital markets are wanting. What is your company doing to become more carbon neutral? But also, how is your company socially responsible? We have seen indexes now in several stock exchange about gender equality. So this is really the beginning of our conversation, but we need to create really a top-down approach, but also a bottom up. And every one of us, wherever we are connected from in the world today, has a power. Who are you buying from? What company are you taking your products? Who are you giving your money to? If you start having an impact with that, companies will start shifting what they do. So let's not forget that we are all actors of change. Yes, we're focusing on men, but we all have a power and a role to play in driving inclusion in our world.
That's so fascinating. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I've known you and worked with you for 4 years, and I've seen that evolution, from the gender equality to the diversity space, and it is just admirable the work that all three of you guys are doing in this space. I loved how you said, and Gary and Angela, about the role of men, and how they can define what role they'd like to play. Now, if you guys don't mind, from the audience, and the first one, maybe Angela, you could answer this. It's what patterns do you see regarding male allyship with your clients in other regions compared to Latin America?
Great. Well, that's a good question. As I said earlier, we've definitely seen a surge of activity in the LATAM Caribbean region over the past year, 2 years, and this topic. And so in that respect, I think it's very similar to other parts of the world. What we see globally, there's just a really intense interest. I think that what's unique to the region that's a little bit different, maybe say if we look at North America or parts of Europe, is that there's still a lot of fundamental work that appears to need to be done around what Stephanie just so eloquently spoke to, kind of the business case and drivers of allyship, and really that there's still this need to establish what men would get out of an allyship arrangement. And I think one of the things that we often tell organizations when we start working with them, and I would say that this is something that we spend a lot of time on in this region, is really very head-on confronting some of the immediate assumptions, the kind of, Stephanie used the word backlash, that comes when men are asked to stand up and be allies. There's always an assumption that the power, the privilege that they occupy within an organization is somehow going to be eroded. And that's not the case. This is additive. And there's a lot of time that needs to be spent to really building that. And I think that in Latin America, Caribbean, we see that organizations perhaps need to spend culturally a little bit more time establishing and going through that. It's true in every region that it needs to be addressed, but we do see that that this kind of thinking, this kind of challenge is very entrenched in this region. So what does that mean from a roadmap perspective? It means that the companies, employers need to really have a very intentional and deliberate plan around how they're going to make progress. We said that the actions to engage men as allies, they're not rocket science. They're something within the reach of every organization, but it takes persistence. It takes focus. It's not something that one training is going to accomplish. And I think that as organizations in this region start to think about how they're going to tackle it, they need to understand it's an ongoing change management process. And even though the tactics themselves aren't difficult or challenging, it will take time to ensure that it gets embedded and gets sustained.
Terrific. Thank you, Angela. And it's true. It's not the one and done. It's the consistency that every company can take to ensure they're going to the right direction. I have a question here in our chat from Michael Kaufman. And he's saying, we're seeing an increase in male ally groups within organizations. What distinguishes between groups that really make a positive impact and those that are only window dressing? Not sure if Gary, you'd like to take that one, or you can all jump in. Feel free.
Yeah, it is an excellent question that, sometimes we will create a employee association to have a conversation that goes nowhere. And so I think, one, it does matter that there's interest in male identified employees who see themselves as having a stake in this, but it's also key that leadership in organizations take the issue seriously and are enacting policies that make it come true. Otherwise, we end up with a lot of talking that quickly fizzles out, or ends up being the one-off talk that, hey, we've talked about sexual harassment, you guys all know about it, everybody back to your workstations and we're done. So I think it really is about, seeing this as visible action within corporations, seeing leadership take it seriously, being transparent about the metrics of it. Nothing like showing salaries in very transparent ways, showing your numbers in terms of women, men, other kinds of diversity as well, in terms of your hiring. And I really liked Angela's comment as well around looking outside our corporate walls. There's a lot of corporations doing this work really well internally, but we've also got to think about externally. And I think what is required of corporations as citizens also needs to be held out there. Latin America in particular has seen increasing inequality and increasing poverty during the economic downturns caused by COVID and many other factors. And I think we also need corporations not to be just kind of islands of excellence for themselves, but how they participate in the world outside. So a clear example for us, groups that participate in our discussions around the global corporate parental task force can't just have good policies at home, that is within their walls. We also think they need to be allies for passing legislation to have equitable parental leave for the country as a whole, to see that there's social protection policies for those who don't have a job to take leave from. So I think, the other part of equality I want to see is that it happens internally, but I also see our role as, IDB, as calling out inequality, our role as civil society, to really call out when we see harm, and also to call out when we see good practices. So I really take that message that I want corporations to do it well. I want to see leadership bought into it. I want to see the metrics, and I want the numbers to be transparent in terms of corporations holding themselves accountable to it. And then we as civil society and groups like IDB need to keep the pressure on as well. So it's not, as Michael said, just a matter of window dressing.
I think that's really important, Gary. And it brings to the point of, on the one side, the awareness building so that men know that there's a benefit, because we have a question here that's actually speaking to this. Sometimes men may feel like D&I initiatives make them lose professional space or put them in a place of unfair disadvantage. What would your advice be to them?
I think one is that we, and I would love Stephanie and Angela to comment on this as well. One is that there are some aspects of this that are win-win. Workplaces do get better with diversity and inclusion. Profit margins usually get better on that as well. And I think when they live this externally, we see communities and countries get better. But there are other issues that we have to talk about. There's only a few positions in the C-suite. There's only so many seats at a board table. And there we do have to talk about equity and not push away from those questions to say, sometimes men, you are right. When we make the world 50-50, you are competing in ways you didn't have to before. That is called fairness, that is equity, and we don't walk away from that. So I think we have to be willing to say that, look men in the eye and say that is the case. What you thought was a guaranteed trajectory for you in an unfair society, because that's what we're talking about. It was unfair. Now, when it's fair, it does mean the competition is stiffer for certain things that you will want in your life. But to acknowledge, and I think going back to the point that I made before of any of us, if we hang all of our life happiness on, did I get that position at an organization, are going to feel that our life hangs by a thread. But if I measure success by the people who I love and I care about and they care about me, and that's one aspect of my work, did I climb and reach that position? I'm less fragile. And I feel like, my failures are less, or obstacles are kind of less difficult to face. And also just my happiness doesn't rest on, did I get that one job? So I think that's the kind of tough love conversation we have to have with men about this.
I love that. And I think that redefining success is, as you mentioned earlier, for men and for women, it's important to have that. And I don't know if Stephanie or Angela, you want to speak on how to elevate and raise awareness for the benefits.
I think Angela was going to jump in.
Yeah, sure. Gary, agree with everything you said. And from our perspective, the key is transparency, active communication, and change management. In the absence of communication and leaders talking about the impacts of these things, there will be an assumption of kind of the worst case scenario. And the reality is it takes time for change to happen. And it's important for organizations to share the data around current state. I think that can be a very powerful lever in this type of journey. It's, in our experience in working with senior leaders all over the world, when we start to collect data on things like the promotion, hiring, retention rates of women, what their experience in the workplace is, those kinds of things. And very often, you know, the data shows that women are at a disadvantage. The same things are not happening for women as men. When we start to share that data with senior leaders, there's an awareness building, and suddenly they realize some things that they may not have been aware of before, and it creates a powerful catalyst for the change. So transparency about current state, expectations for future state are really important, and having the right data to enable that journey can be an important enabler.
And maybe very quickly to top off what my colleagues mentioned. So, you know, I like to say that when we talk about diversity and inclusion, we're also talking about relationships of power, right? Who has the power now? Who doesn't? Who's willing to give up some power, right? And that's never an easy conversation. To Gary's point, when you think about it, yes, absolutely. Now you're going to compete with way more people, right? And there's where equity comes in. But quite frankly, you know, what men tell you behind closed doors is like, but why is that the people behind me did get that seat and now I have to compete with a lot more people? That's not fair to me, right? And so that's when you start in this is not only a company element, this is a societal framework and how the society has been structured. So this is why whenever we talk about social change, it does take some time. We have 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, right? But we need to continue on this path. And to the question of Michael, and it's great to see that you are connected, right? Yes, of course that there is a lot of window dressing going on right now. Right now, diversity and inclusion is the hot topic, right? So a lot of companies are generally taking some commitments and advancing and really, you know, creating a change from the inside, but some of them aren't. But what I see is that it's going to happen is that those who are not being genuine, it will fall by its own gravity. And when shareholders, because we do see that this is a business element and we see more and more capital being channeled and being conditioned to how are you doing in gender equality or in your diversity and inclusion metrics. I mean, you can see what BlackRock did. You could see at, you know, big consultancies, latest reports on that. You know, there's a lot more escrotrinium going on. So if you're only doing that for window dressing, it will be shown. And last but not least, you know, a lot of times in the private sector, we say, you know, you could be a competitor on the shelf, but not on these topics, because at the end, we're all together in this. And that's why, you know, organizations such as Mark or such as, you know, Promundo, IDB Invest, Mercer, we join forces because this is the only way where we are going to see this happen. And a lot of the conversations on one-on-one with CEOs or that they have, they really reach out to the others, sometimes in their own, you know, sector and say like, what are you doing on this? Because one company itself won't be able to solve it. It's really all together. And I think that that's what I take a lot from our study is that, you know, we had over 260 companies saying, I'm interested in this topic and I want to learn and I want to know and I want to participate. So we're in a good trajectory. We have the roadmap, 10 key actions anyone can take. We could circulate that afterwards. So we're in a good path. We're in a good path.
Well, I'm smiling because I'm looking not only what you guys all just said, but I'm also looking at the chat, and it's just joyful to see people from all over the world. We have people from Jamaica, from Ireland, from my native home of Lima, Peru. So thanks for everybody for tuning in and sending your questions. I wanted to go back. There's the first one here. See, Francisco Panares Lopez. He asks, would you be in favor of positive actions for men in order to request permission to care for children or dependent persons? I'm not sure if Gary or anyone can jump in on that one.
In the sense of, you know, we're talking about affirmative action policies to support men's caregiving. I think we need all kinds of nudges I think we need narrative shift. I think more men need to see other men doing the hands-on care work. We're working with a couple of global brands that are building that into some of their consumer-focused messaging. I think boys need to see it growing up. So it's often difficult to sort of figure out it's normal 30 years later if you didn't learn it as a child. So we also see the importance of teaching this to boys early on. And I think I want to see corporations doing it. We had the chance to interact recently with Grupo Boticário in Brazil, that Brazil has 5 months paid maternity leave and 20 days for men, 5 days if you're not in a certain kind of employer. They're basically equaling the leave that men can have. And they're not saying it as men can have it. They are making it obligatory that men take it when they have a child. So I think it's those kinds of nudges that we need to do to make this normal. Never taking away days that we offer for women caregivers. This is not, we think it needs to be an individual right of any caregiver needing days to provide care, needs those days off. And I think the thoughtful policies that Uruguay and many other countries and many corporations are doing look at multiple kinds of caregiving and see men in our caregiving roles, as well as nudging us or obliging us to carry them out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gary. Well, we're going to be closing soon, but I wanted to also do a shout out for Sueli Tang from Panama. Thanks for your greetings. Also, we have, let's see, one more I saw here. From Chile, Maria Cristina Pino Araya, thank you for sending these greetings. Carlos Enrique Salgado from Peru, we have a couple from Peru. We will answer questions in the chat, we won't lose that, but I wanted to make sure that I give each of our panelists just at least 1 or 2 minutes to tell us if there's one thing that you want everybody to take away with about this report. Please share that now. And maybe we'll start with Angela.
Great, thank you. Well, again, it's been such a pleasure to be here today, and thanks everyone for all the wonderful questions. Engaging men and allies is a critical part of the journey to equality of opportunity, experience, and pay, which is at Mercer what we encourage organizations to really solve for all people, not just women, but for all people. To do that, and this has come up again and again in our conversations today, pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion and equality is something that is a fundamental business capability. And I would invite all of our employers here today to start to think about how do we transform the way that our journey, our diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. So it is a fundamental business capability, the same way that you might be pursuing environmental or sustainability actions. It's not something that the Human Resources Department owns. It's not something that's limited to a group that, an affinity group or something of that nature, but it's something that you have fundamentally embedded. And it's something that you've equipped not just leaders, but leaders, managers, everyone within the organization to have the kind of awareness and skills that they need to effectively participate in the journey. And again, I just go back to what I said earlier. When women thrive, businesses thrive, and societies thrive. And again, we really invite you to read the report and see the roadmap on how your company can really effectively make that journey.
Thank you, Angela. And maybe Gary, if you have any parting words of wisdom for our audience.
No, I think it was telling, and Angela brought this up earlier, that by far the single largest thing that women said they want from men in the workplace in the study is empathy and respect. And I think I want to sort of look us as men in the eyes and say that doesn't seem too much to ask. To really take that to its fullest and to be the better human beings that we can be feels like a pretty amazing ask, and maybe a fantastic permission for men to be fully connected human beings. And I think that's, for me, the pathway that helps us get out of a scarcity look at this. Because I think the first thing that men, as they look at this, is kind of well, something's going to be taken away from me. This notion of scarcity. There's only 4 widgets at the table, don't take one away from me. Unless we say, well, what if we can build a bigger table? And what if, as building a bigger table, women simply want us to be fully capable, connected, caring human beings? I don't find that frightening. And I hope we can work with other men not to find that frightening. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. Yes, empathy and kindness go a long way, especially during these days. And Stephanie, if you have any pearls of wisdom to share with us, we'd love to hear it too.
So first of all, thank everyone that connected. It shows that this is a topic that is interesting and that people want to join the conversation and be actors of that. So thank you. Muchas gracias a todos los que están conectados. I love what Gary said, right? About we need to encourage the men in our workplace, but I would say also the men that we have at home and that our friends, family, because we're not separated beings. And again, I think the pandemic show it. We have several facets of our lives. So let's really create those bridges and start changing behaviors at home, because that will also translate to behaviors in the workplace. So I think that's something that I would like everyone to take on with them today, as well as the fact that, yeah, we focus this conversation on men, but each one of us has a role to play. Whether it's, speaking up for another colleague, or if you see a male colleague that did something and you trust them, why don't you reach out to him and like, hey, maybe this happened in this way, why don't you do it the next way, like that? A lot of times there's biases and people might not be acting on the best interest without even knowing about that, right? And I think the last one is definitely, gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. It's not only for the groups that are directly, I would say, targeted. It's about every one of us. It's relevant for every one of us. Equality makes companies more profitable, work environments more productive, more inclusive, frankly, better to be working on. And ideas are way more innovative. And something that is so important, particularly talking about men, is that gender equality, and Promundo has been saying this for lots of years, will make men happier both in work and personal lives. And this is important because happy person is like a healthy person, and it will bring a healthy working space. So I would say that, again, this is not only business, this is benefit for everyone in the communities. And just to close, again, thank you to our colleagues from Mercer, Promundo, the Gender Parity Accelerators, and all the companies that participated in the report. Thank you very much for being proactive actors of change of gender equality in our region. And last but certainly not least, to the team that made all of this report and work possible, Chris, Karina, Isabel, and thank you so much for making this report a reality. And again, thank you to everyone that connected. Muchas gracias.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And thank you so much, Gary and Angela and everybody who's watching now. We really have enjoyed having you here. If you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be answering them, but don't miss downloading the report. The link is in the chat as well. And have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.